So I'm going to pick up on the conversation that we started this morning. We talked a fair bit about wearable computing and pervasive computing, ubiquitous computing, and some of its implications. I'm going to talk about those, and I'm going to focus on the increasing context as people more and more are engaging in a practice that I think of as personal experience capture, or what some people are calling life logging. And the future is so bright, we got to wear shades.
Meet me in front of Strand Books at 2.
Okay, so I'm stopping that a little bit early because I think most people have seen one or other version of Google Glass, which has also been a subject that we've talked a fair bit about today. It's a sexy topic, it's a topic filled with celebrity, but it has a rather gritty and I think richer sort of historical context in which it developed. This is not somebody who I met at the Boston bus depot. It's actually a research collaborator of mine. He's a professor from the University of Toronto. He's a mechanical engineer. His name is Steve Mann, spelled M-A-N-N. Ironically, I guess, because he's a self-proclaimed cyborg. And he was actually pictured in the back row of a picture that Sandy showed this morning as part of the crew that was developing wearables at MIT. Steve was in the back row, and it's something he's been working on and thinking about for a long time. Well, I got to know Steve Mann when he phoned me up several years ago and asked if I would represent him when he wanted to sue Air Canada, our local airline provider, because they were discriminating against him as a cyborg, which I found very interesting. But as he continued to speak to me on the phone, I did what any respectable privacy expert would do. I Googled him. And in so doing, that's what I saw. It wasn't somebody in an ABBA jumpsuit, but in fact, I later learned someone standing on top of one of the tallest banking buildings on Bay Street in downtown Toronto, probably stealing electricity and bandwidth for some of the projects that he was doing, but I don't want to say for sure. In any event, Steve has been doing this stuff with wearable computing since the 80s, and you can sort of see his trajectory of basically taking the entirety of the Radio Shack supply core and putting it on his body. But then you see as he moves into the 90s that he's in fact got his systems down, and you can imagine them now in 2013, so that they're relatively inconspicuous. And Steve's really interesting because in fact, in 1999, his iTap was in many ways an inspiration for some of the models that we're looking at today. So I'm thinking about the topic of personal experience capture, not just through the lens of Google Glass, but through its historic sort of origins. And Steve Mann's iTap, which I won't go into explaining other than basically he shines a laser beam into his eye, it turns his eye into a camera, and his body, because it's packed with all this web serving equipment, everything he sees since the 90s has beamed in real time onto the web, which made some people nervous at MIT, where he almost got kicked out ostensibly because other grad students were uncomfortable with the privacy implications. I think more likely because DARPA's lab was next door. In any event, this is sort of a prototype that he's working on today. You can see it's relatively inconspicuous into the lens of the glass, but to give you a sense of what Steve Mann can do and what really he has been doing for 25 years, I'm just going to show you a couple clips.
The pieces that I put together are from diverse combinations of military hardware, surplus military hardware, broken cameras, broken camera equipment, and all kinds of other pieces that I managed to assemble. I think the true spirit of invention is working outside the boundaries of what was intended. Like the beautiful thing about a computer, for example, is the fact that you can get it to do something the manufacturer never intended it to do. It's the perfect transmogrifier or the perfect general purpose machine.
Now that concept Steve's talking about, that which goes back to Marshall McLuhan and was probably made famous by the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, this idea of the transmogrifier, I think is really important because a lot of the policy discussion tends to focus on the technology of the day, especially when it's got a fair bit of media. And what we have to remember is that although some of the privacy functions built into the current round of devices are there, there's always going to be people building apps to try and use them in different ways, and there's always going to be people building other kinds of systems. One of the things that Steve has been interested in from the outset is less about navigating his way around a particular space and hooking up with buddies online than it has been sort of about getting involved in social interaction, but also in a sort of more deep-seated interest he has in what he calls a virtual memory prosthetic. The idea that these things are our external brains, and here's what he says
very
about
soon
that.
When a small hard drive that can fit in your shirt pocket will be able to record your entire life. And I imagine maybe my grandchildren would put on my eyeglasses and re-experience my life as I experienced it. And more generally, we'll share these experiences and we'll capture baby's first steps because we'll already be remembering them. Isherwood's old metaphor, I am a camera. Now, of course.
So just going on from there, what's interesting about Steve's technology is it's homegrown. And by that, I think you can see what I mean by that is that he gets no research ethics board approval from his university. And it's particularly interesting in light of some of the work that he does, which is what he's become famous for is this concept of surveillance. Sort of a play on the French word surveillance, which means to watch from above. Surveillance, of course, meaning to watch from underneath. Steve, of course, being interested in the power dynamic that changes when all of a sudden the citizenry is geared up with these kinds of technologies and can watch the watchers.
Taping? I'm Jennifer.
Oh, so you are a manager of the store?
Yeah, we don't allow any type of videotaping in the store.
I was concerned because this thing looks like it might be taking my picture. Is that videotaping me?
We do have cameras in our store.
So do you have pictures of me?
I really couldn't say.
Because I don't want anyone having a picture of me without my permission.
Okay, well, I really couldn't say. Look, gone.
Is there pictures of me?
There's another one?
What is this?
There's another one.
iTap camera is sort of like the Colt 45. It's the great equalizer. It allows everybody to be packing heat.
Okay, so we're all going to be packing heat in the future think that we're now imagining. And in fact, this is something that this sort of field of study has actually developed as a serious, rigorous academic experience. Now, this doesn't stand for the fish. This stands for CARPE, which is in fact an annual workshop of the ACM. And CARPE stands for the Continuous Archival and Retrieval of Personal Experience. So Carpe Diem, of course, is its root, literally to seize the day, to log our lives, to be able to capture ubiquitously in the sense that, for example, an airplane has a black box, these being the black boxes of our life. And the idea goes back to this guy. I just promise to keep my other co-speakers who are coming after me awake during this. I thought I'd do one hand-raising thing just like Woody Hartzog did. How many people know who that guy is? Not too many. If I say his name is Vannevar Bush, does that help? He had a small startup in the 1940s. It's called the Manhattan Project. They built the atomic bomb. Anyways, Vannevar Bush, after he realized that the game was pretty much over for scientists who were war scientists, came back after World War II. And if you haven't heard of this piece before, I highly recommend you read it. It's really one of the most fascinating things you'll ever read. It's called As We May Think, which he published in The Atlantic in the mid-1940s as the war ended. And as you can see from the headline there, it sort of starts to make it as though he's thinking about what artificial intelligence is. But in fact, the important idea for the purposes of our current discussion is that he coined this term called the Memex. The idea of a Memex is it's this extension of our memory. It's something which is external, but which can be used in a particular way. And if you read that passage there, you start to see that it sounds a lot like the current place we're in now in terms of what our technologies are doing. Now, the important thing to take away about Vannevar Bush, which is in his article, but I'm not really showing any slides on, is that he was interested in this idea of using technology to further science. And he wrote this article from the perspective of an elite scientist. But what he was interested in, as you can sort of get a sense from that picture that I showed there, is the idea that we could extend the scientific record with ease. So rather than doing all these cumbersome, inefficient things like writing stuff down, we would wear cameras strapped to our head and record everything. And the idea would be that the scientists would own that record, they would have control over that record, and they would not only be able to extend the record of scientific investigation and discovery, but more important, they would be able to learn how to consult the record. Extending and consulting the record really is one way of describing the goal of big data. As Van Bush said in his article, there is no point in having an extensive record if it cannot be consulted and used, and that's what he was interested in inspiring scientists to develop. And so in thinking of this idea of this scientist walking around with this camera strapped to his head and looking at Steve Mann and the kinds of things that he does, I think we start to see what's going on here. And so I just want to sort of finish by, Steve is now just in the news a couple of weeks ago developing a competitor project for Google Glass, and it will be interesting to see what Steve and other people come out with. But in my last minute or two, I just want to bring up, hopefully for the purposes of the discussion that will ensue, some of the potential threats here. Obviously, privacy is foremost among them. But the threats sometimes come from different places. The first place that threats come from is from other people. In the sort of vernacular that we're talking about these days on the urban online dictionaries, if you will, we talk about the glass hole. We're talking about other people who are capturing personal experience, not necessarily with our consent, and as people discussed this morning, the discomfort that comes with not being able to control or in any way consent to the idea of that being on the record. So that's been the primary focus in the debate about personal experience capture so far, the idea that other people will take pictures and whether some kinds of notifications is sufficient to protect people's privacy. Of course, the technology itself has to be really thought through, and when I say the technology, I also mean that in the larger sense of the business models underlying the technology. This is an old slide. If I was to update this slide, I'd have to probably have 3 slides of the different kinds of personal experience capture devices that are out there. Each one has a different business model, collects the information in different ways, mediates what's going on in different kinds of ways. And the last one sort of to mention in terms of the players, of course, is the state. We can imagine a situation where the state, being interested in civil liberties, makes sure to have rules and laws that say that this device has an on-off switch, right? You can imagine that. But we can also imagine a world, which we're pretty close to in the past little while, where at least at particular times, there is a mandate that the system must be remaining on, right? You can imagine during a bombing incident, during a marathon or something like that, that everybody who's wearing these things, the device remains on. And you can imagine other kinds of things. So it will be a really interesting future to think about that. Donald Norman, one of the famous usability scholars, in thinking about these early iterations about 15 years ago, said something which I found interesting looking at in the current context. Of course, he wants all the virtues of the machines and none of the disadvantages, the scientific version of eating the cake and having it too. And he says, after all, if I carry my own information bank with me at all times, with me in control, what are the deficits? Well, I don't disagree if those are the premises under which these technologies work. But it seems to me that the business models for these kinds of things are where all of the information is mediated, and all sorts of people want to get a hold of that information because, as we heard this morning, that information can be used in the public good. So there are questions of control here that are at stake. There are questions about consent, some of which we've already talked about this morning. There are questions about reasonable expectations. In the United States in particular, which is different from my own country of Canada, Justice Scalia has said in a number of decisions, most importantly probably the Kylo decision, that as soon as a technology finds itself in general public use, people no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy. I think we're going to have to rethink some of those things, especially in light of what's going on here. This will be my last major point. And that is that what we see as people pick up these devices and get interested in these devices and want to give their blood to be able to wear these devices, that every person who does that is making a little micro choice a little choice to waive privacy in their context and for them, but in ways that affect the rest of us as well. And as people post things on Flickr and Tumblr and Facebook and do all of these things, the question becomes interesting. What happens when there are so many of these micro waivers of privacy in the way that mouse clicks generate money for advertising? How does this affect and impact reasonable expectations of privacy? And I would end by saying that what this represents is the pathology of the notion of privacy as an individual right. The control and consent model, which I think was heralded this morning as still a potential solution alongside contracts to some of these enormous problems we face, to me actually represents a problem which is probably intractable and which probably requires a major rethink in terms of providing functional equivalents that would maybe capture the protections needed, but without the fantasy of talking about the idea that we actually control this stuff or that we actually consented around its collection. And that really means rethinking privacy, not as an individual right only, but rethinking it as a broader social value. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm thrilled to be able to participate alongside a group of amazing artists who have been collected here, who I think sort of show that broader picture than the lawyers tend to think about. And I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you very much.